Hi, good morning, and welcome to episode 3 of our Mental Health and Wellbeing in COVID-19 webinar series. Super excited to be back with you guys today. If you're joining us for the first time, let me just introduce who we are. My name is Theron Nightenfit, and I have my colleague Mark Baker on the line with us. You want to say hi, Mark?
Yeah, hi everyone. Great to be here again.
Good to see you, Mark. I see that yesterday you inspired me with your dressing up, but I've outdone you today. I've actually gone with a tie. So I want you to up your
Well
game,
done.
please, a little bit tomorrow. Anyway, listen, today we have some very exciting stuff lined up for you, and we'll get there in a second. We have a guest who's joining us today for the first time. Alex Kilgour is a psychologist. I'll introduce her a little bit later when we get her on. But today we are going to be looking at how to override negative tendencies to create flourishing. But before we do that, let's just jump back and just do a slight recap of what we looked at yesterday in the webinar. Yesterday, we looked at 3 concepts: the power of the mind, how the mind functions, and our bias towards negativity. You'll remember we spent a little bit of time talking about psychology and neurology, and yesterday we spent a lot more time on the psychology side. Today, we're going to be jumping into the neurology side of that. And the key question I asked you yesterday is, what will your positivity ratio be during lockdown? Because you see, we have the power to override some of those negative ways of seeing the world by actually inputting some positivity into our lives. And we talked about how this is the secret weapon that we have that'll help us to face some of the challenges coming forward. And the challenge to you was to try get that ratio to 3 positives to every 1 negative. Okay, so that's what we looked at yesterday. Let's jump into what we're looking at today. We're looking at 2 really exciting things. Now, this first thing is the cycle of emotional addiction. And I find this as a layperson myself, not with experience in the field of psychology. I have found the cycle of emotional addiction to be a really interesting and insightful model to help me understand what's going on in my mind and in my thought patterns. So I think it's going to be super helpful for you guys today, and I'm looking forward to you guys being empowered by that. And then, of course, after we've looked at that, we're going to look at what does it mean to take control, and how do we take control of unhelpful thought patterns. So without further ado, Mark, I'm going to throw the ball to you. Walk us through the cycle of emotional addiction. What is it? Explain it to us. How does it work?
Yeah, thanks so much, Theron. I think, I just echo what you're saying. This has been, for me, one of the most helpful theoretical aspects of neurology and helping me to understand how the mind and the brain, in other words, the psychology and neuroscience overlap. And yesterday we just touched on the cell called a neuron, which are the individual cells in the brain. And I just want to quickly touch on how these little cells process information. And then we're going to have a look at how that links into the cycle of emotional addiction. So you've got a neuron on the left over here, and you can see the green arrow gives a direction of a signal. Now, the signal that gets passed down this little wire it goes in the form of electrochemical impulses. It's an electrical impulse that comes in at the top of what's called the synapse. You see this enlarged section over here. So the signal that comes into the synapse is an electrical frequency, essentially. And that electrical impulse comes into contact with these little vesicles that house neurotransmitters. And depending on what the electrical signal is, the frequency of that electrical impulse, that determines which vesicles get pushed to the end and which neurotransmitters essentially burst and get released into the space between the 2 neurons and then get absorbed into the receptor sites, which then, of course, then get translated into electrical impulses. And this electrochemical impulse process is how neurons process information. The key takeaway for us here, Theron, is it is our thoughts that determine the frequency of the electrical signal. So if we can change our thoughts, we can change the electrical impulse and we can change the chemicals that are released. So if we now translate that into the cycle of emotional addiction as it applies essentially throughout our body, and just to put a caveat in here, this really is an overly simplified view of what's happening neurologically. So this is from some of the work of Joe Dispenza, and we're just representing it very simplistically here. But essentially you can see on the top left over there, there's a picture of the brain. The little red part of the brain is called the pituitary gland, and it says they're cocktail from the pituitary gland, because I like to think of the pituitary gland a little bit like the bartender of the brain. It makes the chemical cocktail mix that our brain is wanting to release into the body. And let's say, for example, these little circles and triangles represent shame and anger, the emotions of shame and anger, which I would expect right now, Theron, are quite common in this lockdown. People are quite ashamed to tell their families their salaries have been cut, or they can't make their payments, or, you know, there might be a whole lot of anger looking at some of the people that have driven home in Porsches at the outset of this lockdown, while the employee salaries are being cut by 50, 60%, you know, in some instances. So let's say shame or anger is experienced. Those chemicals get released into the body and come down to the cells. You can see the first cell there with the DNA in the middle. These little receptor sites, the little green goody-patooties there that are receiving the chemicals, when they are full up, think of them a little bit like parking bays. When there's an excess of shame or anger, the cells go through a process of upregulation where they make more parking bays. And when we've made more parking bays, there's a part of our brain called the hypothalamus, and go right to the end of the cycle now. You'll see it says there the thermostat. The hypothalamus acts like a thermostat in the body. It wants to keep us in a place of homeostasis where we are in balance. And so that means that if we have empty parking bays or more chemicals for the parking bays we have, the hypothalamus is essentially going to tell the pituitary gland, send more shame and anger. And of course, our 86 billion laptops, those 86 billion neurons, are going to go to work interpreting the world in a way that will give us the thoughts of shame or anger. And we'll interpret anything in the world around us in that way. So, you know, the reason this is powerful for us is when it comes to expressing ourselves effectively, what we have to understand is that neurologically, the feeling of feeling bad, you can see on the left there, neurologically, that is the feeling of being unfulfilled. And so then something like the voice is going to rise up. And this, I like to think of this as like the little devil on one's shoulder that starts saying, shouldn't you be thinking something shameful or anger-induced? Don't you need your chemical fix of shame or anger? Look at what your wife Robin has done, leaving the toilet seat down. She doesn't care about you. Or she slept in this morning. She didn't make breakfast. She must hate you. And so this neurologically translates, if you follow that arrow, into neurologically we feel good when we experience what is most familiar, what makes us fulfilled, and that is what we experience as being good neurologically. And so people want to feel good, in inverted commas, neurologically, and that may mean, Theron, for many people, that that actually is in fact shame, anger, or frustration that people are experiencing to feel neurologically good, because it is giving them their chemical fix of emotional addiction. What are your thoughts, Theron?
Yeah, just let me just jump in and summarize this. I'm coming from the layperson's angle. So the way I understand this, Mark, is that we've got these structures in our brain where we've got these neurons that wire together to form like sort of pathways or highways in the brain. And what happens is we have our thoughts that come down the main sections of those neurons, and they're electrical frequencies. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but they come down as electrical frequencies, and that's what we think. That's actual thought. By the time it gets to the end, it needs to hand over that message to the next neuron. And the way it does that is by releasing certain chemicals into that synaptic space. And those chemicals are actually what we feel. That's what we're saying, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, broadly speaking, that's spot on. I mean, I was chatting to a psychiatrist the other day about this topic, and he just said, you know, the brain and neurology and how it all works is just so deeply complex that we don't even understand the very beginnings of it. But from what we know right now, that's a fairly good summary of it. I think the best summary, Theron, is if we go to this principle that people would have been hearing quite a lot in any research around neuroscience. And you'll see it there, neurons that fire together, wire together. This is our main principle, that the more we have certain thoughts, the more we establish neural pathways, like highways, that make it more possible for us to have those thoughts in the future. And of course, the antithesis is also true. Neurons that don't fire together are less likely to wire together anymore. So the more we can stay away from negative thought patterns and have positive thought patterns, the more we start rewiring our brains. And this whole process is called neuroplasticity. And so you can see that what we really want to do is to make sure that we are wiring our brains through the thoughts that we have in the direction that we would actually want them to go, rather than succumbing to our emotional addictions. And I think, Theron, there really is just a fantastic narrative or metaphor that we've used on Mygrow that I'd love you to share if you remember it.
Yeah, I'd love to tell that story about the two dogs. Before we get there, I just want to, sorry for keep jumping in like this. I just got to make sure the viewers are tracking, because I know that for those of us who talk about this stuff all the time at work, we're very familiar with it. But it seems to me that what you're saying is that we have these sort of structures in our brain that are neurologically there, they're biologically there, and they serve the way we see the world. If we're interpreting all these negatives and need the negative thoughts, which result in negative chemicals, that needs to be translated. So we have these parking bays, and we have a supply and demand issue. So when we don't have enough negative things in the world, we scan the world to find them, because we have these parking bays that are waiting to receive negative chemicals to be able to live out the infrastructure that they're there for. But of course, we can do that positively as well. We can use the neural architecture to help us feel good about the world as well, but that takes effort as well. So as you can see, we've used those different characters to remind that if you invest in positives in your day, in your life, you start building the architecture in your brain to sustain that way of living. And as you mentioned, there's this great story that I'd love to tell you. You guys know I'm a storyteller. I love a good story. So there's this old fisherman, right? And he had these two dogs, a light dog and a dark dog, for the purposes of this webinar. And of course, he worked really hard during the week. He did his fishing, he did all of that. But then on Saturday morning, it was playtime, and he used to, not playtime like you'd imagine with dogs, but it was time to head out to the town and put on a show for the spectators there. And he liked a bit of a wager. He liked gambling, and so did a lot of the townsfolk. So every Saturday morning, he had this tradition of taking his two dogs to town and putting them in a dog fight. And everyone loved this, and they'd bet on this dog or that dog. And some of them would say, "Oh, I think the light dog is going to win this week," and others would say, "No, I'm going to put my money on the dark dog." And some weeks the one dog won, some weeks the other dog won, and you could never really tell. So it kept it interesting. But someone started noticing that this old salty fisherman, he also used to be laying some bets there on the side. He always used to pick one of the dogs to win, and people started realizing that most weeks he got it right. He was actually making some money out of this whole deal. And someone said to him at one point, "What's going on here? How come you always know which dog is going to win?" And he looked around to make sure no one was listening to him. He didn't want to spill the beans, didn't want the secret to get out. But his response was, "The one that wins is the one that I feed the most." So the sly fisherman was pulling the wool over everyone's eyes. He was rigging the whole thing. He was feeding one dog more than the other dog so that he could, he could know how to get his money on a Saturday morning. Now that is true for what we're talking about. We could have these negative neurological pathways. We could have the positive neurological pathways. The one you feed is the one that is going to win. That view of the world is the one that's going to rise to the top. If we invest in positives, that neural architecture is going to slowly start building up, and your brain will be rewired, because cells that fire together, wire together. The one you feed is the one that wins. But it's not only us who feeds different ways of seeing the world. Our context actually feeds that as well. Context is a little bit like a river. It actually, if you jump into it, it'll pull you along in a certain direction. So yes, we have ownership and we have agency, but our surrounding impacts us as well. A great example is you might want to quit smoking, but if everyone you always hang around is always smoking, it's going to be a lot harder to do it, because your context is pulling you in a certain direction. Maybe you're trying to eat healthy, but everyone in the house is just eating junk food and rubbish, and it's really difficult to actually create a new habit when your context is pulling you along in a certain way. Now, one of the things we haven't talked about too much in this webinar series is the impact of the context of work. Now, we're no longer in that context. We're at home. We're all in lockdown here. But the context that we've come from is a context that has fed certain ways of seeing ourselves, certain ways of seeing the world, which has resulted in neurological architecture, in these neural pathways that make you see yourself and the world in a certain way. Now, this is where we're going to bring in our colleague, Alex. So welcome to the show. Alex, are you live? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Great. We're looking forward to having you. Alex is a psychologist who's worked her whole career in the corporate space. She's worked in big corporate. She's worked in smaller corporate. She's and currently in a role that consults a lot to corporate. So she's got a great view of looking at how does the corporate context actually shape who we are, and what kind of impact is that going to be having in this current moment where we're not at work, we're at home, either in our pajamas or dressing up like me. So, Alex, just got some questions for you, which I think might just make this process run a little bit more smoothly. My first question for you is, what are some of the emotions that people are used to feeling in, let's say, a large corporate?
Yeah, look, I think that's a good kind of question to start at, because I think that, that forms the basis for a lot of, these context types of questions, these negative tendencies. So, when we go into big corporates, smaller companies, some of the trends can, sometimes look a little bit more similar. So, obviously the intricacies of big businesses mean that there's a lot of people, a lot of different types of roles, a lot of systems, a lot of, resources that are on the go. And I think a lot of the trends that I see when I go into, various clients and organizations in particular is that, there's a lot of red tape that a lot of people can get frustrated by, a lot of, kind of a deficiency, a lack of story that a lot of employees seem to be telling themselves, sometimes some pessimism, a little bit of politics. We all joke about the politics, but I think, I do see it happening quite a lot. And I think a lot of employees are trained to kind of just suck it up, get the job done, and just, live to Friday to get home to spend time with, with your loved ones. So I think there's a lot of people who feel that they may not necessarily be in control.
Yeah. I mean, Alex, this is super interesting, because what I'm hearing from you is that you're seeing a context in a corporate environment that's almost causing people to think and behave in a certain way. And that reminds me very much of the chemical fixes that people would need to get over time with something like emotional addiction.
Yes.
Can you maybe help us to apply some of that to the current environment families might be finding themselves in? So, what are some of the fixes that people will need to find from their families as they are going through this lockdown?
Yeah, you see, this is where it becomes so important to think about what the context has been previously. If employees are used to getting their, let's say these fixes at work, be it perceived disrespectful team members or perceived incompetent managers, or this red tape or a lack of access to systems, to resources, it can bring on a lot of feelings of this frustration, this anger. I like what you were talking about earlier, Mark, about the shame and this anger. And I think there's also a lot of anxiety that this lockdown has brought on. So these are some of the feelings that are coming up when we get our fixes at work. Unfortunately, these fixes have not changed during the lockdown. So we are still looking for our fixes, and unfortunately it has to happen now in our context, wherever we are, at home, with housemates, with partners, with kids. So although the physical environments have changed and have shifted around us, neurologically our brains are still probably feeding and kind of looking for these negative tendencies to be filled.
So one of the things that would be great, Alex, is just to apply some very specific examples.
Yes.
Washing the dishes at home, doing the laundry, being at home all day long at the moment. What are some ways that you think the context of our work lives might have helped, might be impacting on the kind of frustrations, resentments, senses of we out of control while we are going through this lockdown?
Well, the problem here comes in is that the actual events themselves, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but the actual events themselves may not be as bad the event itself. But unfortunately, when we are looking for a fix, when we don't have that manager, coming to us and asking for deliverables that were due yesterday, when we don't have the kind of the work pressures that we face in the environment, unfortunately it can become little events like, Mark, you joked about a toilet seat being left up, or there's no breakfast in bed, no breakfast being made and prepared for you. So these events that are not negative, huge events in and of themselves, unfortunately for us to get the fix, become quite big in our minds, and we then need to feel resentment, or feel some anxiety, or unfortunately it's not the events themselves that prompt these big fixes for us. It's just these tendencies towards negative events because of how our neurons are now wired, essentially.
So I get this picture, Alex, of someone who's in senior management might be used to people responding to their demands and requests because they have a measure of power in a corporate context. But then when they end up in their home context and they're just asking for a cup of coffee, well, their teenager might say, well, you go make your own cup of coffee. And that could lead to a significant amount of anger or frustration in the current context, because the emotional wiring is that the world serves my needs, Alternately, you might have an employee that's so used to just being told what to do, having zero agency, I think you touched on this earlier, to change anything in their work environment because they have to wait for management to okay everything. That now when they get into the home environment, they feel that they can't actually initiate anything in their families or with their friends to create any kind of positive change. And I think those little ways of behaving are going to be some of the most taxing things for people as they live through this lockdown.
Yes, exactly. And perhaps not even realizing, we may not even be realizing why small things are so taxing.
Yeah.
And I think it is important to really, to Theron's point, come back to what is the context that has kind of formed some of these negative tendencies and negative thought patterns. And just, trying to recognize what exactly is going on internally.
So let's shift a little bit then, Alex, to, it does sound a little bit like a doomsday story that we are sharing with everyone here. I think all we're saying is that neurologically we probably have been versed in certain emotions and ways of thinking that are perhaps not going to help us through this lockdown. But maybe you could just speak to what is it that we could do to take control of some of these unhelpful tendencies?
Definitely. I mean, I don't think I would be here if it was just to say it's all doom and gloom, all the best, everybody, during lockdown, goodbye. That's not really, that's not hopefully why I'm here. But it really leads me to feed into a really, really important technique that we use on Mygrow to move away from these negative tendencies, these negative thought patterns, and to kind of take control of them. So unfortunately, I don't have as much time as I would like to really go through all the literature behind and the research. What I can speak in very broad terms about is what we is called the ABCDE technique. So it's one of it should be on the slide now, so you can see that this helps us structure our experience of the world around us into 5 categories. So of course, A, activator; B, beliefs; C, consequences; D, dispute; and E, this is all about effective thoughts and behaviors. So I'm going to talk us through this, as I said, really, really briefly. There'll be additional resources that can go with this to really explain it in a lot more depth. And here, what it centers around is how activating events cause certain beliefs that we may have, and these are often irrational beliefs, unfortunately, and these beliefs are the ones that lead to negative, often emotional consequences for us. So that's quite a helpful thing to think about here, is that it's not the actual activating event that is causing C. It's not A to C. You can see it's the beliefs about the events that are causing these consequences. Okay, so think about
Alex, it seems like it's not the fact that maybe my wife Robin is not helping with the dishes or putting the toilet seat up. Those are the activating event. It's my belief that perhaps she doesn't care about me or she doesn't consider me. It's that belief that leads to the consequence of negative emotional frustration. Is that right?
Exactly, and I think this is the really meaningful and insightful part, is that it's not necessarily the event that is causing negative emotions, unwanted emotions, unpleasant emotions. It's actually our beliefs about those certain events. I want to move us through here to D and E, of course, is to see that these negative, irrational beliefs can be disputed. And if they are disputed in favor of more rational, more positive beliefs, they can lead to more effective thoughts and behaviors. So, you can stop after, believing that the negative events that they are the actual events as opposed to our irrational beliefs, but really following this technique all the way through to E really does result in being able to be aligned to more rational beliefs that are much more helpful in everyday life, especially during this lockdown, where a toilet seat is really not because your beautiful wife doesn't love you.
Thanks, Mark. Let me jump back in here and just drive us to the end. Alex, thank you so much for everything that you've shared. Your input has been incredible. It's been phenomenal. Thank you. I'm sure the listeners have really benefited from it as well. Yeah, what a great technique this is, the ABCDE technique. It is something that has had a lot of impact in people's lives. Been, as you mentioned before, really well documented. Yeah. If you haven't yet signed up for Mygrow, you can go and grab that free offering that we're doing, the COVID-19 free offering, the 21-day access. You can go to the mygrow.me website and go sign up for that right now. And then, of course, you can follow through down to where on the bottom left there, that tab that says COVID-19. We have a great resource that's in there for you to understand how this technique actually works. It walks you through the process in quite a bit more detail than we were able to do this morning. And you can practice that technique by yourselves at home. It really does have an impact. We're pretty much done for this episode. Thanks so much, Alex, for being part of this and for being online with us. And Mark, of course, as always, thank you to you and your input and everything that you've offered. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think this stuff is very, very empowering and very helpful for people. So I trust that our viewers have had a treat this morning and have been able to get something that's really going to help them to really just feed the positive dogs. That's the one that wins.
Yeah.
If you're new to this webinar series, please don't forget to share with your friends. If you're finding any value, please get your friends and family to sign up and get them involved and get them on board. Tomorrow we are going to be looking at relational connection in a time of social distancing, and we have another guest who's going to be joining us. You may be alone, you may be with others, but we're all in this together. Stay safe, stay healthy, protect what's happening in the way you see the world, and try and invest in those positives. Remember to go do that ABCDE technique, and don't forget to do your droplet on Mygrow each morning. We'll see you guys tomorrow.